The year is 1803. The air in the Mississippi Territory, in the lands that would one day be carved into the state of Alabama, is thick with humidity and the drone of cicadas. But on one particular night, another sound cuts through the oppressive heat. It is not the cry of a night bird or the rustle of some unseen creature in the sugarcane fields. It is the smell of burning pine, yes, but underneath it something else. Something acrid, something deeply unsettling and horribly organic. It's the smell of burning flesh. This is not the scent of a pig roast or a side of beef left too long over the fire. This is a forbidden smell, one that poisons the night air and clings to the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks. For those few who live close enough to the Levallois plantation, this macabre aroma is accompanied by a sound even more disturbing. A single prolonged scream that seems to tear at the very fabric of the darkness, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that is suddenly, unnervingly cut short. What follows is a silence more profound and terrifying than any sound that preceded it. The fire burns on, a lone, horrifying beacon in the vast, swampy darkness. The witnesses, other enslaved people locked in their cabins, and perhaps a few terrified neighbors peering from behind shuttered windows, do not speak of what they see. They do not dare. To acknowledge this midnight pyre is to invite the same fate. What is happening on the Levallois property is not justice, nor is it a simple act of punishment. It is a ritual, a macabre display of absolute power, orchestrated by a woman whose cruelty has already become a whispered, forbidden legend. The story of this night would be suppressed, banned from official records, and scrubbed from the ledgers of polite society. It would survive only in hushed tones, a ghost story told to frighten children, a dark stain on the land that could never be washed away. This is the story of a cold case from the dawn of the American South, a tale of a song that cost a life, and a mistress who committed an act so horrifying it borders on the demonic. To understand the horror of that night, we must first journey back, peeling away the layers of time to a place that felt more like a feudal kingdom than a part of a burgeoning new republic. The year 1803 was a time of violent transition. The Louisiana Purchase had just been signed, and the American frontier was a raw, untamed landscape where fortunes were made and lost on the backs of human beings. The area that would become Alabama was a patchwork of French Creole culture, Native American tribes being systematically displaced, and ambitious Anglo-American settlers. It was a place where the law was often little more than a suggestion, easily bent or broken by those with enough land, money, and ruthlessness. At the heart of this volatile world was the plantation system, an institution built on a foundation of unimaginable brutality. The Levallois plantation was one such place, a sprawling enterprise carved out of the fertile black soil near the Tombigbee River. Owned by Monsieur Arnaud Levallois, a man of French Creole descent with a weak constitution and an even weaker will, the plantation was, in reality, the dominion of his wife, Madame Delphine Levallois. Her name was spoken with a mixture of awe and terror. She was renowned for her porcelain beauty, her sharp intellect, and her impeccable taste. The Levallois manor was an island of European refinement in a sea of rustic wilderness, but beneath the silks and lace, behind the polite smiles she offered at social gatherings, dwelled a coldness that was profoundly unnatural. It was a chilling emptiness that many noted in her eyes, a void that seemed to absorb the warmth and light from any room she entered. The plantation itself reflected this duality. From a distance, it was idyllic. Up close, it placed meticulous, oppressive order, governed by a set of rules so draconian and arbitrary that they seemed designed not for efficiency, but for the express purpose of inflicting psychological torment. Madame Levallois' obsession with order was legendary, but it was her fixation on one particular element that was most disturbing: silence. Absolute, unbroken silence, especially after the sun went down. To her, the sounds of the night were an affront. The chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, the distant howl of a wolf, each was a chaotic note in a world she sought to control completely. This obsession extended, most terrifyingly, to the human beings she owned. After dusk, the slave quarters of the Levallois plantation were expected to be as silent as a tomb. A cough, a cry from a restless child, a whispered conversation, any of these could bring swift and brutal punishment. The overseers, men chosen for their cruelty, enforced her rule with the whip and the brand. But even they seemed to fear the mistress. Her punishments were not merely physical, they were creative, designed to the spirit as much as the body. Stories circulated among the enslaved community, whispered from one plantation to the next. They spoke of a stable boy who was made to stand in a barrel of freezing water for an entire night for humming a tune while grooming the horses. They spoke of a kitchen maid whose tongue was seared with a hot poker for dropping a pan too loudly. These were not rumors, they were warnings. Madame Levallois believed that sound was a form of defiance, a crack in the perfect, controlled world she had built around herself. A world where she was the sole author of reality, and everyone else was merely a character subject to her whims. Why she craved this unnatural quiet was a subject of much speculation. Some said she suffered from a nervous affliction, a malady of the mind that made sound physically painful. Others whispered of a darker, more macabre reason, a secret she guarded so fiercely that even the slightest noise felt like a threat, a potential unraveling of the carefully constructed facade of her life. The woman at the center of this forbidden history, the one whose voice would trigger the ultimate act of barbarism, was known as Celeste. Unlike the mistress, her history is not recorded in any family Bible or property ledger, save for perhaps a single-line item noting her purchase. Her story, like that of millions, has been largely erased, surviving only through the fragile medium of oral tradition. From these fragmented whispers, we can piece together a portrait of a young woman, perhaps no older than 20, who had been sold to the Levallois plantation from a smaller, less oppressive farm in the east. She was known for two things, her resilience and her voice. It was said that Celeste carried her songs with her like a hidden treasure. They were not songs of joyous celebration, but of deep, aching sorrow and unshakable faith. They were spirituals, hymns passed down through generations, melodies that spoke of hope in a hopeless world, of a promised land beyond the sugarcane fields and the overseer's whip. For the other enslaved people, her singing was a balm, a moment of shared humanity in a life that was designed to strip them of it. In the fleeting moments she could steal, in the fields under the blistering sun, she would hum quietly, her voice a low, mournful thread that wove them together. But she knew the rules of the plantation. She understood Madame Levallois' macabre obsession with nighttime silence. For months she had obeyed, smothering the music that lived inside her, locking it away as the sun dipped below the horizon. The nights at the Levallois plantation were long and suffocating, filled with a dread that was almost a physical presence. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, menacing, the sound of a predator holding its breath. But on this one fateful night, something inside Celeste broke. Or perhaps something grew stronger than her fear. What could compel a person to defy a rule they knew was backed by the promise of unimaginable pain? The exact reason for Celeste's song that night is lost to history, but the stories that survived offer a few heartbreaking possibilities. One version of the tale claims her newborn child was sick with fever, crying inconsolably in their small, dirt-floor cabin. In a desperate attempt to soothe the infant, Celeste began to hum, her voice barely a whisper. The tune was a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, a soft, gentle melody that spoke of crossing the River Jordan. As the child's cries softened, her humming may have unconsciously grown into a soft, subdued song, a mother's desperate prayer carrying on the humid night air. Another, more defiant version of the story suggests her act was not one of desperation, but of quiet rebellion. Perhaps the day had been particularly brutal, the work harder, the punishment for some minor infraction more severe than usual. In this version, her song was not for a child but for herself. It was a spiritual, a song of deliverance like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," a quiet declaration that her spirit, at least, would not be broken. It was an act of reclaiming a piece of her own soul in a place that sought to own it entirely. Whatever the reason, the sound was faint. It would not have been audible from the main house under normal circumstances. But Madame Levallois was not normal. Her ears, it was said, were unnaturally attuned to any sound that broke her mandated curfew of silence. She was a hunter, and the quietest whisper of defiance was the prey she stalked from the lavishly decorated rooms of her mansion. On this night, as she lay in her four-poster bed, the faint, mournful notes of Celeste's song reached her. And to Delphine Levallois, it was not a lullaby or a prayer. It was the sound of a declaration of war. The reaction inside the manor was immediate and chilling. Monsieur Levallois, by all accounts, was a man who lived in the shadow of his wife's tempestuous nature. He likely heard the singing too, but would have chosen to ignore it, to pretend he was asleep, anything to avoid a confrontation. But there was no ignoring Delphine. The story, as pieced together from the accounts of house slaves, describes her sitting bolt upright in bed, her body rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't rage or scream. Her anger was a far more terrifying, silent thing. She simply rose from the bed, moving with a calm, deliberate grace that belied the storm brewing within her. She lit a single candle, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, making her look like some spectral figure from a Gothic nightmare. She dressed herself, not in a simple nightgown but in a day dress, as if preparing for a formal, important occasion. Every movement was precise, methodical, and utterly devoid of hesitation. She did not wake her husband. She did not summon the overseer. This was a matter she intended to handle personally. The other slaves in the house, huddled in their pallets in the hallways and kitchen, watched her descend the grand staircase. They saw the look on her face, an expression of serene, unholy purpose, and they knew. They knew that a line had been crossed, a taboo violated, and that the night would not end without a horrifying spectacle. Every household charged with a dreadful anticipation. Madame Levallois was not just going to punish a disobedient slave. She was going to make an example. She was preparing for a ceremony, and the entire plantation was to be her unwilling congregation. This dark chapter of our nation's past is filled with countless such stories, many of them deliberately erased. If you believe these forbidden histories deserve to be unearthed and remembered, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Because the deliberate, methodical steps Madame Levallois took next are a descent into a truly macabre realm of human cruelty. Madame Levallois strode out into the humid darkness, the single candle in her hand doing little to pierce the inky black of the moonless night. She was followed by two of the plantation's most brutal enforcers, whom she had roused with a quiet, firm command. They moved toward the slave quarters, a collection of ramshackle cabins that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the main house. The singing had stopped by now, as if Celeste had suddenly realized her transgression, or perhaps her child had finally fallen asleep. But it was too late. The silence she now offered was not the one the mistress had demanded. It was a silence tainted by the memory of a song. As the trio approached, a wave of fear ripped the quarters and families huddled together in the dark, praying the mistress's wrath would pass them by. They could hear her footsteps, calm and even on the packed earth. They could hear her stop outside Celeste's cabin. There was no shouting, no banging on the door. There was only a quiet, commanding voice that sliced through the night. "Bring her out." The door was forced open with a splintering crack, and Celeste was dragged from the cabin, clutching her feverish child. She was terrified, confused, begging for mercy, explaining that she was only trying to quiet her baby. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Madame Levallois did not look at her with anger. She looked at her with a chilling, detached curiosity, like a scientist examining a specimen before dissection. She ordered one of the men to take the crying infant from Celeste's arms and give it to another woman. Celeste screamed, a raw, primal sound of a mother being separated from her child. It was a sound of pure anguish, a sound that should have broken any human heart. But to Madame Levallois, it was merely another form of noise, another impurity to be cleansed. And she had a very specific, very horrifying method of purification in mind. The concept of justice on a plantation was a grotesque parody of the real thing. The owner was the law, the judge, jury, and executioner. Celeste, no formal accusation beyond the one that existed in the mistress's mind. Her crime was singing. Her sentence was to be decided on the spot, dictated by the whim of a woman whose whims were notoriously depraved. As Céleste was held fast by the two enforcers, Madame Levallois circled her slowly, holding the candle aloft. The flickering light illuminated Céleste's tear-streaked face, then moved to the mistress's own, revealing an expression of profound, almost ecstatic satisfaction. This was her theater, and the performance was reaching its climax. "You were told," Madame Levallois said, her voice soft, almost conversational, which made the words all the more terrifying. "You were all told. The night belongs to silence, my silence." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority was absolute, her capacity for cruelty already well established. But this time, she wanted to do more than just inflict pain. She wanted to eat a memory, a scar on the collective psyche of everyone she owned, a permanent reminder of the cost of disobedience. She turned to one of the men. "The usual punishment is insufficient," she declared. "A whipping is temporary, the scars fade, the memory of pain dulls." She paused, letting the horror of her implication hang in the air. "This transgression requires a more permanent lesson, one that will not be forgotten." She looked around at the dark, silent cabins, knowing that behind every wall terrified ears were listening. She was speaking to them as much as she was to Céleste. She was laying down a new law, written in blood and fire. The men holding Céleste exchanged a nervous glance. They were hardened, brutal men, but even they seemed unsettled by the direction their mistress was heading. What she was contemplating was beyond the pale, an act of such monstrous extremity that it violated even the unwritten codes of the brutal plantation world. What Madame Levallois proposed horrifying of even the most city era, that as a figure of peace, she ordered the men, not a large mall concentrated, built around a post driven into the. She specified the for its resinous way it would catch fire with an intense heat, chosen with deliberate cruelty. Between the cabins would be forced to see in, now move fearful obedience would, Madame Céleste tied to the Céleste by the sickly in a state of shame, unable to fully of what was happening. Pleas had subsided, desperate whimper. The other enslaved ordered out of their cabin stood in a silent circle. Masks of terror, their disbelief, horror, that flayed skin. They had seen brand stints in the stocks. This was something different, not punishment, sacrifice. Was nowhere to be. He was house, paralyzed wife, or absence. His word. His was a form of consent, silent affirmation, unchecked. As the pyre grew heat, the only thing of branches being soft, steady, who watched an unwavering masterpiece of every detail had the smell of pine selective fear, complete. Céleste was bound tightly to the post, her simple cotton shift offering no protection, her eyes staring into the darkness, perhaps searching for a sign of mercy in a world that had none. The assembly of unwilling spectators stood like statues, too terrified to move, too horrified to look away. This was the core of Madame Levallois' lesson, their forced participation. By making them watch, she made them complicit in their own subjugation. She was demonstrating that she had the power not only over their bodies, but over their very senses, forcing their eyes to witness an act that would forever haunt their nightmares. Madame Levallois took a torch from one of the men. The flame danced wildly, casting grotesque seemed to then recoil from the scene. She approached the pyre. There was no final pronouncement, no dramatic speech. Her actions spoke for themselves. She looked directly into Céleste's eyes, and for a moment the only sound was the crackle of the torch. What passed between the two women in that final, silent moment, we can only imagine. Was it a flicker of defiance in Céleste's eyes? A final, silent prayer? Or just the vacant stare of a soul already resigned to a horrifying fate? The mistress's expression remained unchanged, a placid mask of divine righteousness. She believed, perhaps in her own twisted way, that she was not committing murder but restoring order, cleansing her world of an impurity with fire. She lowered the torch to the base of the pyre. The resin-soaked kindling caught immediately, and a small, hungry flame began to lick at the dry wood. The fire spread with a terrifying speed, climbing the pyre, its light growing from a flicker to a hungry, roaring blaze. The horrifying ritual had begun. The moments that followed are the most difficult to recount, a descent into a truly macabre and disturbing scene that feels more like a medieval witch trial than an event in 19th century America. As the flames grew higher, a collective gasp quickly went of onlookers. The fire illuminated the entire clearing, painting the terrified faces of the enslaved people in flickering shades of orange and red. It was a vision of hell, brought to life in the Alabama wilderness. Celeste was silent at first, perhaps from shock or from the smoke that began to billow around her. Then, as the heat intensified and the first flames touched her skin, the scream that had been heard by the distant neighbors finally erupted. It was a sound of pure primal agony, a sound that conveyed a level of suffering beyond human comprehension. It was a sound that would be seared into the memory of everyone who heard it. And through it all, Madame Levallois stood and watched, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She was not disgusted. She was not horrified. She was, by all accounts, transfixed. This was the ultimate silence she craved. The scream of her victim was, to her, the chaotic noise of the world being burned away, purified into the final, perfect quiet of death. The smell of burning pine was now overwhelmed by that other, more terrible scent. The sight was one of unspeakable horror, a human being consumed by fire, their life extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. The enforcers who had built the pyre took a step back, their faces pale in the firelight. Even these men, accustomed to violence, were shaken by the sheer extremity of their mistress's cruelty. This act placed her in a different category of evil. This was not the work of a harsh disciplinarian. This was the work of a monster. The horrifying spectacle lasted for what must have felt like an eternity. Celeste's initial scream of agony eventually subsided as the fire did its gruesome work, her voice giving way to tortured cries that grew weaker and weaker until they were finally extinguished. The only sound left was the roar and crackle of the flames. The pyre burned for hours, a ghastly monument in the center of the plantation. No one was allowed to leave. Law decreed that until the fire had. They were forced to watch until nothing remained but glowing embers and a charred, blackened post. This forced vigil was the final, twisted turn of the screw. It ensured the image, the sounds, and the smell of the night would be permanently etched into their minds. It was a lesson in terror that would never require repeating. When the first hint of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, painting the smoke-filled air in hues of gray and pink, the fire had died down. Madame Levallois, who had not moved for hours, finally turned to the exhausted, traumatized crowd. "Now," she said, her voice clear and calm in the morning air, "there is silence." With that, she turned and walked back toward the main house, her silhouette framed against the rising sun, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The enslaved people were finally dismissed, but they did not speak. They moved like ghosts back to their cabins, the horror of the night having stripped them of the ability to form words. The silence the mistress had craved had finally been achieved. It was the silence of absolute terror, the silence of broken spirits, the silence of a community that had just witnessed the absolute depths of human depravity. The sun rose on a plantation that was forever changed, but the scene of a forbidden, macabre crime that would haunt the very land itself. In the days that followed, a pall of unnatural quiet hung over the Levallois plantation. It was the silence of a graveyard. The work continued, driven by the overseers, but it was performed by people who seemed more like automatons than human beings. Their eyes were vacant, their movements sluggish. They avoided looking at the center of the clearing, where the scorched earth and the blackened stump of the post served as a constant, grim reminder. They especially avoided looking at Madame Levallois, who went about her days as if nothing had happened. She managed her household with the same meticulous precision, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. There was no sign of remorse, no flicker of guilt in her cold eyes. To any outside observer, she was the perfect portrait of a refined, southern gentlewoman, but to the people she owned, she was something else entirely. She had crossed a line, transforming from a cruel mistress into a figure of almost supernatural dread. She was a specter of death who walked among them in the daylight. The fate of Celeste's child is a detail often lost in the horror of the mother's death. The oral history suggests the infant, already weakened by fever, did not extinguished, another small tragedy buried beneath the weight of a greater one. The story of what happened that night began to leak out, but only in the most cautious of whispers. It traveled along the secret networks of communication that existed between plantations, a horrifying new tale added to the grim folklore of the slave community. It was a warning, a story about the monster of the Tombigbee River, the beautiful mistress who burned a woman alive for the crime of singing a song. But these whispers were dangerous. To speak the story was to risk attracting the attention of the very evil it described. News in the rural South traveled slowly, but a story this disturbing, this macabre, could not be entirely contained. Whispers eventually reached the ears of other white planters in the region. The reaction, however, was not what one might expect. In the brutal calculus of the slave-owning society, the enslaved were property, and a master or mistress had the right to do with their property as they saw fit. While some may have been privately unsettled by the sheer barbarity of the act, there was no public outcry. No sheriff was called, no magistrate opened an investigation. To do so would have been to challenge the very foundation of their society. The absolute and Valois act, while extreme, was ultimately seen as an internal matter, a particularly harsh but legally permissible act of discipline. She had not killed a person in the eyes of the law, she had destroyed a piece of property. In fact, some accounts suggest that her husband, Arnaud Levallois, was more concerned about the financial loss than the moral atrocity. Celeste was a young, healthy slave, and her destruction represented a significant loss of capital. This cold, economic reality is perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of the entire affair. It reveals a system so morally bankrupt that a human life could be reduced to a line item on a ledger. The burning of Celeste was not a crime to be punished, but a financial misstep to be regretted. Madame Levallois, therefore, faced no legal consequences for her actions. She was untouchable, protected by a wall of laws, customs, and a collective societal agreement to look the other way. Her cruelty was not only tolerated, it was enabled by the very system that had made her a mistress in the first place. The silence she had enforced on her plantation was now mirrored by the silence of the wider community. The absence of legal justice did not mean there were no consequences. The consequences simply took a different, more ethereal form. After the burning, the Levallois plantation began to acquire a dark reputation. It became a place people avoided, a property that was said to be tainted. Travelers would take longer routes to bypass its lands. Neighboring planters, while publicly silent, began to distance themselves socially from the Levallois family. The stain of Madame Levallois' act, though not a crime in the eyes of the law, was a social and spiritual one. It marked her and her home as a place of unnatural evil. The most profound consequence, however, was the birth of a curse. The enslaved people, living daily with the trauma, they spoke of a cold spot in the center of the clearing, a place where nothing would grow on the scorched patch of earth, no matter how many times it was tilled and seeded. They reported hearing things in the dead of night, even on evenings when the mistress demanded absolute silence. It wasn't the sound of a scream they heard. It was something far creepier, far more unsettling. It was the faint, mournful sound of a woman humming a lullaby. This is the point in the story where history blurs into folklore, where a documented atrocity gives way to a ghost story. But for the people who lived on that plantation, the haunting was real. It was a manifestation of their grief and their terror. It was a belief that even though the laws of man had failed, the laws of the spirit world would not. They believed that Celeste's song, which had cost her her life, had now become a permanent echo, a curse upon the woman who had silenced her. The story becomes a powerful narrative of supernatural retribution, a cold case that would be adjudicated in a court beyond the grave. The curse did not seem to affect only the land. It began to creep into the walls of the great house itself. The stories passed down claim that Madame Levallois, the architect of the horror, began to change. Her obsession with silence deepened into a full-blown paranoia. She would spend hours sitting in a darkened room, listening intently for the slightest sound. She complained of hearing a faint humming that no one else could hear, the very melody that had driven her to murder. She became a prisoner in her own silent kingdom, haunted by the ghost of a song. Her beauty, once so renowned, began to fade. A gaunt, haunted look entered her eyes. She grew withdrawn and mistrustful, prone to violent outbursts over the smallest of noise. Says a creaking floorboard, a distant church bell, the rustle of leaves outside her window. Her own home, a symbol of her power and control, became her tormentor. The house slaves whispered that Celeste's spirit, often called a platai in Gullah and Creole folklore, was walking the halls at night, seeking its stolen child and its stolen life. They spoke of objects moving on their own, of doors opening and closing, and of a pervasive cold that would settle in a room whenever the mistress entered. Her husband, Arnaud, already a weak man, reportedly descended into alcoholism, unable to cope with the chilling atmosphere of his home and the monstrous woman he had married. The Levallois fortune, once so robust, began to dwindle. Crops failed under mysterious blights, livestock sickened and died, and the plantation's productivity plummeted. Whether this was the result of a supernatural curse or simply the consequence of a plantation run by fear and trauma, the effect was the same. The empire of silence that Delphine Levallois had built with fire and terror was now crumbling from within, eaten away by the very horror it had created. The darkness she had unleashed upon another had turned back on her, a slow, creeping poison for which there was no antidote. The ultimate fate of Madame Delphine Levallois is shrouded in mystery, a fittingly enigmatic end for a woman who lived her life behind a facade of secrets. There is no grand, final act of justice recorded in the history books, no satisfying conclusion where she is held accountable for her crimes. Instead, the historical trail simply goes cold. The Levallois family vanishes from the public record. One version of the legend, the one favored by those who believe in supernatural retribution, is particularly macabre. It claims that one night, several years after the burning of Celeste, a fire broke out in the main house. Unlike the controlled, ritualistic fire that killed Celeste, this one was a wild, uncontrollable inferno. The fire started in the mistress's own bedroom and spread with unnatural speed, consuming the entire mansion before anyone could mount a rescue. The tale insists that as the house burned, the plantation workers and neighbors heard two sounds: the terrified screams of Madame Levallois, trapped in the flames, and woven beneath them, the clear, beautiful sound of a woman singing a spiritual. In this telling, she was consumed by the very element she had used as her instrument of torture, a perfectly symmetrical, poetic, and horrifying end. However, this is likely folklore, a story created to provide the justice that the real world denied. More plausible historical theories suggest the Levallois family simply collapsed under the weight of their own infamy and financial ruin. They may have sold the cursed plantation at a massive loss and moved away, changing their name to escape the dark shadow that followed them. Perhaps they fled to New Orleans, or even back to France, hoping to bury their disturbing past in a new land. In this scenario, Madame Levallois would have lived out her days, perhaps dying peacefully in her bed, an old woman haunted only by the ghosts of her own memory. This lack of a clear, documented end is, in many ways, more disturbing than the fiery legend. It suggests that a person could commit such an act of pure evil and simply vanish, fading back into the anonymity of history, her crimes unpunished, final, regardless of the family peer, the plantation they behind a playful decade, property fat, fields over, and root the great or swallow ivy zoo. They've rotted apps, leaving faint earth. The land was banned, a place no one arm, no one would to build on. Came a land in the locography of that warned children away. The singing ghost and the wicked mistress became a cornerstone of local macabre folklore. People who were brave enough, or foolish enough, to venture near the ruins of the plantation at night reported strange phenomena. The most common report, passed down through generations, was the sound of a woman's voice, softly humming a lullaby, seeming to emanate from the spot where Celeste was burned. Others reported seeing a faint, flickering light in the ruins of the main house, or feeling a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, even on the most sweltering Alabama nights. These stories served a purpose. They were a way of keeping the memory of the atrocity alive in a society that actively into its own history. The affected island, the ghost story, the historical record, was a narrow, biddenry that served the of weapon, that a end, aimed test was for the being, that her murder, Laval, created a sea of so pound that permanent are the self. Story of power mind sometimes are great, they see the very whole of us, that some once sucked, find a echo for. It is upping to the brilliance in the face of systematic erasure. The legacy of this disturbing tale extends far beyond a localized ghost story. It serves as a microcosm of the larger systemic horror of slavery. The story of Madame Lavalois and Celeste, while extreme, is not an anomaly. It is, rather, a stark illustration of the absolute power dynamics that define the institution. The legal framework of the time provided no recourse for the enslaved, who were considered chattel, not humans with rights. An owner's power was, for all intents and purposes, absolute. This story forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the only holding the most instances of own and in like Laval's, that was entirely evident. This also highlights particular ability in women who all face death of school, cyclically dubbed Mistress. Perfect and late amid a facet off sealed belsalty which one lead on those no to fight. This trig violent song also silic. Music particularly spirals, vital form of cultural expression, communication, and spiritual resistance for enslaved people. It was a way to preserve their humanity, share coded messages, and express a hope for freedom that could not be spoken aloud. By making a song a capital offense, Madame Lavalois was not just punishing an individual, she was attempting to extinguish the very flame of hope and cultural identity that the music represented. Her act was a declaration that in her kingdom, there would be no joy, no solace, no hope, only work, obedience, and her prized, suffocating silence. It's a chilling reminder that the fight for survival under slavery was not just about the body, but a constant, desperate battle for the soul. As time marched on, the story of the Lavalois plantation began to fade from living memory, receding deeper into the realm of folklore. The Civil War came and went, tearing down the institution of slavery but leaving the deeper wounds of racism and brutality to fester. The lands of the former plantation were eventually broken up, sold, and repurposed. New homes were built, new families moved in, many of them completely unaware of the horrifying events that had transpired on the ground beneath their feet. The scorched patch of earth where Celeste died was eventually plowed over, and the ruins of the but the story it to die completely. It survived in societies, obscure books on and in the oral descendants of those who in the area. Vast, American history, forbidden stories that are mainstream narrative too important to be historians who have studied recognize them as apps of trauma. Specific details, the Mistress, the song Sari, but the story remains intact, testament to an act of cruelty that was never acknowledged or punished. It is a cold case of the word. Victim and wit long dead has been obliterated. There is no physical eyes. What remains is the ghost self, a dark and distant challenging us to listen and to ignore upon which our guilt. Consider the central tale. Why would a song provoke homicidal simple cruelty? Answer. Even more disturbed on the psychological Delphine Laval was merely a sadist pain or complex work is that she suffered untreated mental, perhaps a form of a disorder or a condition that mounds feel unbearable. In the context of such an affliction understood, seen as a feminine stereotype or a sign of a bad temperament. Her obsession why? Silence could have been a desperate attempt to control an environment that caused her genuine, overwhelming sensory distress. In her warped mind, Celeste's song was not just a breach of rules, but a direct physical assault, an intolerable intrusion into her fragile sanity. This theory does not excuse her actions, but it reframes them from an act of simple evil to an act of pathological madness, which is perhaps even more terrifying. Another, darker theory delves into the realm of secrets. What if Celeste's song was not just any song? Some variations of the legend suggest it was a tune Celeste had learned from Monsieur Lavalois himself, a French lullaby he hummed when he believed his wife was not listening. Perhaps it was a song from his childhood, or one he associated with a past love. In this scenario, hearing the song from the lips of an enslaved woman could have triggered a violent, jealous rage in the mistress. It would have been proof of an intimacy, real or imagined, between her husband and another woman, an ultimate betrayal that in her mind could only be cleansed with fire. The song, then, was not just noise, it was evidence. Evidence of a secret life she could not control, a crack in her perfect facade that had to be sealed at any cost. The second theory, the one rooted in jealousy and secrets, adds a disturbing layer of psychological horror to the story. If Céleste was singing a song taught to her by Monsieur Levallois, it transforms her from a random victim into the target of a deeply personal vendetta. It also recasts Arnaud Levallois from a weak, passive bystander into a central, albeit indirect, cause of the tragedy. His small act of kindness or indiscretion, his sharing of a simple melody, became Céleste's death warrant. This interpretation paints a chilling picture of the inner life of the Levallois household. It suggests a marriage not of affection, but of fear and control. Madame Levallois, obsessed with maintaining her power, would have seen any connection between her husband and another person, especially an enslaved woman, as an existential threat. The song would have been a symbol of her failure to completely dominate her husband's inner world. The public, ritualistic execution then becomes not just a warning to the other slaves, but a horrifying message to her own husband. By burning Céleste, she was demonstrating the terrifying consequences of defying her, of having any part of his life that was not under her direct control. She was cauterizing a perceived wound to her authority in the most brutal way imaginable. This makes her crime even more monstrous. It was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a calculated, symbolic act of domestic terrorism, designed to reassert her absolute dominance over her husband and her household. Céleste was merely the pawn, the unfortunate vessel for a message written in blood and fire, intended for an audience of one. The true horror lies in this cold, reptilian logic, the use of unimaginable human suffering as a tool to win a silent war within a toxic, broken marriage. It's a truly macabre thought, one that speaks to the darkest depths of human jealousy and the terrifying potential of unchecked power. The tools of storytelling and memory in the 19th century enslaved community were powerful and clandestine. Since literacy was forbidden, history, news, and warnings were transmitted orally, through stories, sermons, and most importantly, songs. Spirituals were not just hymns of faith. They were often sorrow songs, expressions of suffering, and sometimes they were signal songs, containing coded messages about escape routes or secret meetings. This context makes Madame Levallois' violent reaction to a song even more resonant. She may have instinctively, or explicitly, understood that music was a form of power that she could not control. It was a language she did not speak, a network she could not infiltrate. A song was a direct threat to her regime of silence because it was a vehicle for community, for shared identity, and for the preservation of hope, the three things most dangerous to the institution of slavery. Céleste's lullaby, while seemingly innocent, was part of this powerful oral tradition. In singing it, she was participating in an act of cultural preservation and quiet resistance. Madame Levallois' decision to make an example of her was a strategic move to crush this resistance. By burning the singer, she was attempting to burn the song itself, to terrorize her captives into abandoning one of their most vital tools for spiritual and emotional survival. The very act of turning a symbol of hope into a trigger for horror is a masterstroke of psychological warfare. After that night, would anyone on the Levallois plantation dare to hum a tune to soothe a child? Would they risk singing a spiritual in the fields to lighten their burden? The mistress had successfully poisoned the well. She had taken their most sacred form of expression and netted into a death sentence. The silence she achieved was not just the absence of noise, but the absence of culture, the absence of solace, the absence of hope. The story of Celeste's horrifying fate is a stark reminder of how history is written by the victors. In the official, documented world, this event does not exist. It is a historical black hole. You will not find Delphine Levallois in a list of notorious criminals. You will not find Celeste's name in a census or a death certificate. Their story lives entirely in the shadow world of folklore, oral history, and legend. This raises a disturbing question. How many other stories like this are out there? How many acts of unimaginable cruelty were committed on isolated plantations, witnessed only by those whose testimony was legally inadmissible and systematically suppressed? How many murderers lived and died as respected members of their communities, their darkest secrets buried with them? The American South of the early 19th century was a vast landscape with countless hidden corners where the law was a distant rumor and power was absolute. The Levallois plantation was just one of thousands of such places, each a potential kingdom ruled by its own Nero or Caligula. The story of Celeste survives by a historical fluke, its sheer, memorable horror ensuring it was passed down through generations. But for every story that survived, there must be thousands that have vanished, erased by time, fear, and the deliberate destruction of records. This thought is profoundly unsettling. It suggests that the history we know is merely the surface layer, a curated collection of events deemed worthy of remembrance. Beneath it lies a vast, dark ocean of forbidden histories, of silenced voices and unpunished crimes. Exploring a story like this is an act of historical archaeology, digging through layers of legend and folklore to find the fossilized truth of a human tragedy. It's a chilling reminder that the past is never truly dead, but it is often deliberately buried. These cold cases of history are all around us, waiting for someone to listen for their faint, ghostly echoes. The location of the original Levallois plantation is now impossible to pinpoint with certainty. The lands have been subdivided, the river has shifted its course, and the landscape has been transformed by 2 centuries of development. But if you were to travel through that region of Alabama today, through the rural counties bordering the Tombigbee River, you would find a land still haunted by its own history. You would find old, antebellum homes, some beautifully restored, others collapsing into ruin. You would find ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, silent witnesses to a past that many would prefer to forget. And if you were to speak to the right people, the local historians, the keepers of old family stories, you might still hear a version of this tale. It might be told as a ghost story to spook teenagers or as a cautionary tale about the evils of the past. The details might be different, but the core elements, the cruel mistress, the forbidden song, the horrifying fire, would remain. The land remembers. This idea that a place can be imbued with the memory of a traumatic event is a powerful and recurring theme in macabre folklore. The concept of a stigma, a psychic stain left behind by an act of intense violence or suffering, is a way of articulating a truth that we feel instinctively, that some places are just wrong. The Levallois plantation became one of those places. The story of its haunting is a way of saying that the moral balance of the universe, so violently disrupted by Madame Levallois, is still trying to right itself. Celeste's ghost, humming her eternal lullaby, is not just a frightening specter. She is a symbol of memory itself, a persistent, indestructible echo of a life unjustly taken. She represents the refusal of the oppressed to be truly silenced, even by death. Her song is her testimony, broadcast across the centuries from a place beyond the grave. It is a permanent, chilling indictment of the woman who killed her and the system that allowed it to happen. Let's re-examine the role of Monsieur Arnaud Levallois. His passivity is a crucial element of the story. He is a portrait of the banality of evil, the quiet collaborator who allows atrocities to happen through his inaction. Was he a man terrified into submission by a monstrous wife? Or was he something more insidious, a willing partner who enjoyed the fruits of her cruelty while maintaining a veneer of civility? His presence, or lack thereof, on the night of the burning is a damning silence. He was the legal master of the plantation. He had the authority at any moment to intervene to stop the madness. He could have confronted his wife, ordered the men to release Celeste, and asserted his control. But he did nothing. He hid, effectively abdicating his responsibility and becoming complicit in murder. This makes his character, in some ways, even more contemptible than his wife's. She was an active, malevolent force, a clear and present evil. He was the good man who did nothing, the hollow man whose moral cowardice allowed evil to flourish. The story serves as a powerful allegory for the dangers of appeasement and the moral rot of complicity. It's a reminder that great evil is often not just the work of a single, monstrous individual, but is enabled by the silent consent of those who stand by and watch. Arnaud Levallois represents a whole class of people who benefited from the brutal system of slavery but outsourced the dirty work, allowing them to maintain a clean conscience while living off the proceeds of unimaginable suffering. His ghost, too, haunts this story, the ghost of a man who sold his soul, not for power or wealth, but for the sake of a quiet, comfortable life, a peace purchased with the ashes of another human being. It's a deeply disturbing thought about the subtle and pervasive nature of evil. The deliberate nature of the execution is what elevates this story from a simple act of violence to a truly macabre ritual. Consider the steps Madame Levallois took: the calm descent down the stairs, the personal selection of the executioners, the specific instructions for building the pyre, the choice of location, the forced audience, and the long, silent vigil. This was not a crime of passion. It was a premeditated, carefully orchestrated piece of psychological theater. Each element was designed for maximum terror and lasting impact. The fire itself is a deeply symbolic choice. Fire is often seen as a tool of purification, and it's possible that in her deluded mind, Madame Levallois saw herself as cleansing her plantation of defiance. She was burning away the impurity of Celeste's spirit, her song, her very existence. But fire is also a symbol of hell, of ultimate damnation. By using it, she was also arrogating to herself the power of God, of being the ultimate arbiter of life, death, and eternal punishment. This God complex is a hallmark of the sociopathic personality, a complete inability to see other people as human beings, but rather as objects to be manipulated or destroyed for one's own purposes. The forced participation of the other slaves was perhaps her cruelest innovation. It was a way of implicating them in the crime, of shattering their sense of community by forcing them to be passive spectators to the murder of one of their own. It was a way of saying, "You are all powerless. Your only hope for survival is to be silent, to be invisible, to be nothing." It was an act of mass soul murder, and its effects on the survivors would have been profound and lifelong. The trauma of that night would have been passed down, a legacy of fear that would shape their descendants for generations to come. The story of a single, horrific crime is also the story of a community deliberately and systematically traumatized. The power of this story lies in its unresolved nature. The lack of a clear, satisfying ending forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the wicked are not punished. Sometimes, they simply get away with it. This ambiguity is what makes the tale so chilling and gives it its enduring power. If Madame Levallois had been brought to justice, if she had been tried and hanged for her crimes, the story would become a simple morality play. It would be a disturbing but ultimately reassuring tale where the moral arc of the universe, though long, bends toward justice. But because she vanishes from the record, the story denies us that comfort. It leaves us with the unsettling possibility that she lived out a long life, untroubled by the law. This forces the narrative into the realm of the supernatural. The ghost story of Celeste's singing spirit is not just an addendum, it is a necessary component of the narrative. The ghost provides the justice that the real world failed to deliver. It is the only force capable of punishing Madame Levallois, of tormenting her with the sound that drove her to kill, of ensuring that she never knows the silence she so desperately craved. The curse on the land and the haunting of the mistress become a form of metaphysical justice, a rebalancing of the scales in the spiritual realm. This is why such tales of supernatural retribution are so common in the folklore of oppressed peoples. When worldly justice is denied, the imagination creates a higher court, a celestial tribunal where the crimes of the powerful are finally judged. The haunting of the Levallois plantation is a powerful and enduring fantasy of justice, a testament to the human need to believe that no act of evil, no matter how well hidden or legally protected, can truly go unpunished forever. It is worth pausing to consider the story from a purely historical, skeptical perspective. Is it possible the tale is an exaggeration, a composite of many different acts of cruelty blended over time into a single, sensational end? Errative? Absolutely. The nature of oral history is that it evolves, that details are embellished to make the story more powerful, its lesson more potent. Perhaps the mistress did not burn the woman alive, but merely had her whipped to death. Perhaps the crime was not singing, but something else entirely. Yet to dismiss the story as mere folklore is to miss the point. The historical accuracy of every single detail is less important than the fundamental truth that the story conveys. It tells us that the system of slavery created environments where such an act was not only possible, but plausible. Women like Madame Levallois existed. Atrocities of this magnitude did happen. The infamous Delphine Lalaurie of New Orleans, who was discovered only a few decades later to have been brutally torturing her slaves in a hidden chamber, is proof that the reality of slavery was often as horrifying as any legend. The story of Celeste and the singing ghost is a vessel, a container for the collective memory of the horrors of the plantation system. It may be a single, focused beam of light illuminating a much larger, darker truth. It is a symbol of the countless unrecorded acts of terror and the resilience of the human spirit that preserved their memory against all odds. To analyze this story is to listen to the whispers of the past, to acknowledge the suffering that was deliberately hidden, and to honor the memory of those, like Celeste, whose only crime was to have a voice. The oral component of this history, a crime triggered by a song and punished by a ghost who sings, is a chilling and unforgettable testament to a past that refuses to remain silent. The story has all the elements of a classic American Gothic tale: an isolated, decaying mansion, a psychologically disturbed and monstrous matriarch, a dark, unspeakable secret hidden within the family, an innocent victim, and a pervasive sense of supernatural dread. It feels like something out of a story by Edgar Allan Poe or William Faulkner. But this is not fiction. It is a story rooted in the real, historical soil of the American South. The Gothic elements are not literary devices. They are reflections of a lived reality for millions of people. The monster was not a creature from a nightmare, but the mistress of the house. The haunted house was not a metaphor, but the literal place of their torture. The unspeakable secret was the everyday reality of slavery. This narrative forces us to see the Gothic not as a genre of fiction, but as a mode of historical experience. Life on the Levallois plantation was a waking nightmare, a world governed by arbitrary terror and grotesque violence, where the lines between sanity and madness, life and death, were terrifyingly thin. The survival of this story as a piece of macabre folklore is therefore fitting. It was too dark, too disturbing for conventional historical accounts. It could only be told as a horror story, a ghost story, because that is the only genre that could possibly do justice to the lived experience of those who endured it. It is a true crime story from a time and place where the crime itself was not recognized by law. The story's survival is an act of defiance, a refusal to let the horrors of the past be sanitized or forgotten. It insists that we look into the abyss of our own history and that we acknowledge the very real monsters who lived there. Let us return, one last time, to the central image of the story: a woman being burned alive for singing a song. The sheer extremity of this image is what gives the tale its lasting power. It is an act of such profound, disproportionate cruelty that it defies rational explanation. And that is precisely why it is so important. It shatters any romanticized notions of the Old South, any lingering myths of benevolent masters and happy slaves. It exposes the raw, brutal core of the institution, a system that granted one human being the power to inflict a death of unimaginable agony upon another for the most trivial of reasons. The image is a distillation of the absolute dehumanization that slavery required. To do what Madame Lavalois did, you must first cease to see your victim as a person. You must see them as an object, an animal, a thing to be broken and disposed of when it displeases you. Celeste's song was an assertion of her humanity. It was an expression of her soul, her grief, her love for her child. In the ears of her mistress, this assertion of humanity was an act of rebellion so profound that it had to be met with an act of ultimate dehumanization. She was not just killed, she was unmade, reduced to smoke and ash, an attempt to erase her from existence. But the story's survival proves that the attempt failed. The song, the symbol of her humanity, proved more resilient than her physical body. It attached itself to the land, to the memory of the community, and it echoes down to us today. The story serves as a permanent, horrifying monument. It is a testament to Oh, the woman who was murdered, and a chilling portrait of the woman who killed her. A woman who became a monster in her desperate, pathological pursuit of silence. The enduring legacy of this forbidden history is its ability to challenge our perception of the past. It's a cold case that can never be solved by traditional means, but it can be understood. It requires us to listen differently, to value the sources that have been traditionally dismissed: folklore, oral tradition, ghost stories. These are the archives of the silenced. They contain the truths that were too dangerous to write down. The story of Madame Lavalois and Celeste is not just about a single, isolated incident in 1803 Alabama. It is about the very nature of memory and power. It demonstrates how those in power can control the present by writing the official histories, but how the oppressed can control the narrative of the past through the enduring power of storytelling. The ghost of Celeste, with her mournful, never-ending song, is the ultimate symbol of this resilience. She represents every voice that was silenced, every story that was suppressed. Her song is an eternal protest, a haunting reminder of a debt that has never been paid, of a justice that has never been served. It's a call from the past, asking us not to solve the crime but to simply bear witness, to remember, and to tell the story. The act of listening to and retelling this dark tale is, in its own small way, a defiance of Madame Lavalois' demand for silence. It is a way of ensuring that Celeste's song, the very thing that cost her her life, is never truly extinguished. And so, the forbidden story continues to be told, a macabre whisper carried on the wind, a chilling echo from the dark heart of American history. The psychological landscape of the antebellum South was a breeding ground for figures like Madame Lavalois. The isolation of plantation life, combined with absolute power over a captive population, could warp even a stable personality. For someone with pre-existing tendencies toward narcissism, sadism, or paranoia, a plantation was a perfect laboratory for their darkest impulses. There were no checks and balances. The law, society, and even the church looked the other way. A plantation mistress was the queen of her domain, and her word was absolute law. This environment could foster a profound sense of detachment from reality, a belief in one's own godlike authority. This story is a case study in what happens when the darkest aspects of human nature are given free rein, unchecked by legal, social, or moral consequences. Madame Lavalois was not just a product of her time. She was an extreme manifestation of its pathologies. Her obsession with silence can be read as a metaphor for the entire slave-holding class's desire to silence the truth of their own brutality. They built a society on a foundation of violence, yet cloaked it in the language of paternalism and civility. They demanded the silence of their victims, a quiet acceptance of their fate. Celeste's song was a threat because it broke this manufactured silence. It was a beautiful, human sound in a world that demanded inhuman quiet. It was a note of truth in a symphony of lies. The horrifying violence of Madame Lavalois' reaction was a measure of her desperation to maintain the illusion, to silence the single voice that threatened to bring her entire, depraved world crashing down. The story shows us that true monsters are not born of myth and legend, but are forged in the crucible of absolute power and the silent complicity of the society around them. In the end, what are we left with? We have a crime without a body, a perpetrator without a final judgment, and a victim whose life is recorded only in the ghostly echoes of a forbidden story. It is a tale of profound and unsettling emptiness. There is no catharsis, no resolution, only the lingering chill of a great and terrible injustice. The story of the mistress who burned her slave alive for singing at night is one of the darkest cold cases in American history, precisely because it was never considered a case at all. It was simply an exercise of power, a footnote of cruelty in an era defined by it. But its persistence in folklore tells us that it was not forgotten. The human conscience, even when suppressed and terrorized, has a long memory. The tale survived because it needed to. It served as a warning, as a memorial, and as a form of underground justice. It ensured that Madame Delphine Levallois, even if she escaped the laws of man, would be forever tried and condemned in the court of memory. And it ensured that Céleste, a woman whose name was meant to be erased, would achieve a form of immortality. She became more than a victim, she became a symbol, a ghost whose song represents the indestructible nature of the human spirit. Her melody, which once brought comfort to a sick child, now serves as a haunting and eternal testament to the price of a song. Indeed, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie buried, waiting, in the long, dark silence of the past. The case remains open, its files stored not in a dusty archive, but in the haunted memory of the land itself. The darkness of this story does not lie only in the flames of the pyre or the coldness of the mistress's heart. It lies in the silence that followed, the silence of the law, the silence of her husband, the silence of the community, the silence of the historical record. This great, collective silence was the true accomplice to the crime. It created the world that made the crime possible and then conspired to forget it ever happened. This is why forbidden histories like this are so crucial. They are an act of breaking that silence. They force us to confront the uncomfortable, macabre, and often horrifying truths that have been deliberately buried. The story of Céleste is a single voice rescued from an ocean of forced quiet. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a landscape of human experiences, filled with both breathtaking beauty and unspeakable horror. And somewhere on a still night in rural Alabama, when the air is heavy and the moon is hidden behind the clouds, some say you can still hear it. A faint, sad melody drifting through the pines. A lullaby that has outlasted the whip, the fire, and the grave. A final, ghostly whisper, proving that no silence, no matter how brutally enforced, can ever truly last forever. Some voices can never be erased. Some stories demand to be heard. And the most disturbing cold cases are not those that lack clues, but those that society agreed never to investigate in the first place.